It wasn't exactly my first choice of employment, but jobs were scarce, and I needed the money. The cemetery was small, tucked away at the edge of our town, surrounded by thick, dark woods that seemed to swallow the light whole. When I first walked through the rusted iron gates, I couldn't shake the feeling that the place was more alive than it had any right to be. The air felt heavier, like it was weighed down by something unseen, something waiting. The town itself was old, almost as if it had been forgotten by time. The streets were narrow, lined with ancient stone buildings that leaned into each other like weary travelers. People here were quiet, almost too quiet, as if they knew something that I didn't. When I mentioned my new job at the cemetery, I noticed the way their faces paled, their eyes darting away as if discussing it was taboo. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, and I learned quickly not to bring it up again. The cemetery was no different, old, neglected, a place that seemed forgotten by the living. When I first saw it, I wondered how many people even remembered that it was there, tucked away behind the woods, far from the town's center. But as I stepped inside, passing through the rusted iron gates, I realized that this place hadn't been forgotten at all. The atmosphere was suffocating, oppressive, like the very air around me was trying to force me out. The caretaker, a frail old man with sunken eyes and trembling hands, met me at the entrance. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and he had the look of someone who had seen too much. As he handed me the keys to the gate and an old lantern with a flickering flame, he studied me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "The last watchman," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "He disappeared, you know. Left behind only this." He handed me a crumpled piece of paper. "These rules aren't just for show, son. They're what keep you safe." The rules were simple, written in hurried, messy script. Rule number 1, never let the lanterns go out. Rule number 2, do not answer anyone who calls out to you after dark. Rule number 3, if you hear footsteps behind you, do not turn around. Rule number 4, never under any circumstances open the gate after midnight. Rule number 5, before sunrise, ensure all graves are undisturbed. If any have been tampered with, fix them immediately. As I read through the list, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The rules seemed strange, almost superstitious. But the way the caretaker looked at me, his hollow eyes filled with something that bordered on desperation, I couldn't bring myself to dismiss them. "Good luck," he muttered before shuffling off into the growing shadows, leaving me alone in the cemetery. The first night was uneventful, almost disappointingly so. I walked the grounds, my lantern casting long shadows across the graves. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. The darkness pressed in on me from all sides, the trees at the edge of the cemetery looming like silent sentinels, their branches twisting and writhing in the wind. As I moved through the rows of headstones, I found myself glancing at the note more than once, my grip on the lantern tightening each time the wind picked up. The flickering light cast eerie halos around the gravestones, and I could have sworn that some of the shadows moved when they shouldn't have. But nothing happened. The night passed quietly, and as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I felt a small sense of relief. Perhaps the rules were just that, rules, nothing more. Superstitions meant to keep me on my toes. A week passed without incident. I grew more confident, dismissing the rules as nothing more than a precaution, something the caretaker used to keep me alert. But then, on the 8th night, things began to change. It started with the voices. At first they were faint, just a whisper on the wind, so soft I almost didn't notice. I was patrolling near the northern edge of the cemetery, where the oldest graves lay, their inscriptions worn smooth by time. The trees here were denser, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. The shadows were deeper, darker, and as I walked through them, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Michael," I froze mid-step, the sound of my name slicing through the stillness like a knife. The voice was coming from the shadows just beyond the reach of my lantern's light. My heart pounded in my chest as I remembered the second rule. Do not answer anyone who calls out to you after dark. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was something about it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It was too close, too intimate, as if the person speaking was right next to me, breathing down my neck. "Michael, please." This time it was a woman's voice, soft and desperate. I gritted my teeth and kept walking, trying to focus on the path ahead. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that voice as possible. But the rules, the damn rules, were all I had. "Help me, Michael!" Her voice was closer now, almost in my ear. I could feel her breath on my neck, cold and damp. I didn't dare turn my head, didn't dare acknowledge her. I kept my eyes forward, my pace quickening, the lantern shaking in my grip. The voices continued to follow me, each one pleading for my attention, each one more insistent than the last. But I didn't answer. I didn't stop. I kept walking until the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, bathing the cemetery in a pale golden light. As the sun rose, the voices faded, leaving me alone once again. My hands were shaking as I checked the graves, ensuring they were undisturbed. Everything seemed in order, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. The next few nights were a blur of fear and exhaustion. The voices came every night, growing louder and more desperate. They began to sound familiar, like people I had known in my past, their tones perfectly mimicking loved ones, old friends, and even my parents. It was the voice of my mother that nearly broke me. She had passed away years ago, after a long battle with cancer. Hearing her voice, calling my name with the same gentle tone she used when I was a child, nearly shattered my resolve. I could hear her so clearly, as if she were standing right beside me. "Michael, come here, sweetheart." I had to stop myself from answering, from running towards the voice. My heart ached with the need to respond, to see her one last time, but I knew it wasn't her. It couldn't be. Whatever was out there, whatever was calling to me, it was playing with my mind, twisting my memories into something dark and malevolent. One night, as I patrolled the southern edge of the cemetery, I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow at first, a deliberate, heavy tread that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I stopped in my tracks, every muscle in my body tensed, but I didn't turn around. The third rule flashed in my mind. If you hear footsteps behind you, do not turn around. The footsteps grew closer, each one sending a jolt of terror through my body. I could feel the presence behind me, the weight of eyes boring into the back of my head. My breath came in short, shallow gasp as I forced myself to keep walking, my legs shaking with each step. My mind raced with thoughts, each one more desperate than the last. What would happen if I turned around? Would I see something I couldn't unsee? Something that would drive me mad? The thought was unbearable, so I didn't. I kept walking, my steps uneven and hurried, until I finally reached the gate. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The footsteps stopped abruptly, just as I shoved the key into the lock. I didn't dare look back. I just closed the gate and locked it tight, the cold metal biting into my palm. For a moment I stood there, my heart racing, trying to catch my breath. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost deafening. Then from the other side of the gate, I heard a low, guttural growl. It wasn't human. Nothing human could make a sound like that. I backed away slowly, the growl turning into a snarl, followed by the sound of something heavy slamming against the gate. The metal rattled violently, the hinges creaking under the force. Whatever was out there wanted in, and it was angry. But the gate held. I watched in horrified fascination as the force on the other side grew more frenzied, the snarls and growls becoming almost feral. The gate shook, but it didn't give. Eventually the noise died down, and the thing, whatever it was, retreated into the darkness. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, waiting for the first light of dawn before daring to drive home. The days blurred together, and the nights became a waking nightmare. The voices continued, more persistent and demanding, the footsteps never far behind. I began to dread the setting sun, knowing that with it would come the terrors of the night. My only comfort was the lanterns, their warm glow a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. But then, the lanterns started to go out. It was subtle at first, just a flicker here, a brief dimming there, But soon, whole rows of lanterns would extinguish without warning, leaving entire sections of the cemetery in pitch-black darkness. I'd rush to relight them, but no matter how fast I moved, the darkness always seemed one step ahead. It was as if the shadows were alive, swallowing the light faster than I could restore it. One night, as I hurried to relight a particularly stubborn lantern, I heard it, the faint sound of something digging. My blood ran cold as I realized what it meant. I sprinted toward the sound, my lantern held high, the beam of light bouncing wildly. I found the grave quickly, an old, unmarked one near the back of the cemetery. The soil had been disturbed, a large mound of earth piled to one side. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached, the lantern's light revealing something that shouldn't have been there, a gaping hole, as if something had crawled out. Panic set in, but I knew what I had to do. The fifth rule: before sunrise, ensure all graves are undisturbed. If any have been tampered with, fix them immediately. I grabbed the shovel from the small storage shed and began to work, shoveling the earth back into the grave as fast as I could. The sound of my own breath, heavy and labored, filled my ears, drowning out the whispers that had started again, low and menacing. But as I worked, I felt a shift in the air, a chill that crept into my bones. I paused, my grip tightening on the shovel, and slowly turned around. She was standing there just a few feet away, dressed in white, her long hair matted and dirty. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that stared right through me. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and she took a step closer, her bare feet leaving bloody prints on the ground. My breath caught in my throat as she reached out a hand, her fingers impossibly long, nails blackened and broken. She was so close now, close enough that I could see the faint outline of her skeletal frame beneath the tattered dress. A sickly sweet smell wafted from her, like decaying flowers mixed with something far more rancid. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound escaped my lips. My body was paralyzed with fear, my mind unable to process the horror standing before me. Her smile widened, revealing blackened teeth, and I felt my sanity begin to fray at the edges. But then, just as her fingers brushed my arm, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The cemetery was bathed in a warm golden light, and she vanished, dissipating like mist in the morning sun. I collapsed to my knees, the shovel slipping from my grasp, my body trembling uncontrollably. The grave was filled, the earth packed tight, but I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over, not as long as I worked there. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and jittery patrols. I started carrying a flask of coffee with me, hoping it would keep my nerves steady, but it did little to dull the fear gnawing at my insides. Every shadow seemed to harbor something malevolent. Every gust of wind carried the whispers of the dead. The lanterns, my only source of comfort, began to betray me. No matter how many times I checked them, they would still flicker out, leaving me in total darkness. I would often find myself standing in the middle of the cemetery, surrounded by the black void, listening to the whispers and the distant sound of footsteps drawing nearer. One particularly dark night, as I made my rounds near the eastern wall, I felt it again. The weight of eyes on me, the suffocating presence of something lurking just out of sight. The air was heavy with tension, thick enough to choke on, and the silence was so profound it was almost deafening. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against stone. My breath hitched as I turned my head, the lantern's beam sweeping across the graves. At first I saw nothing, just rows of headstones and the gnarled trees that bordered the cemetery. But then something moved. It was subtle, just a shift in the shadows, but I saw it. I wasn't alone. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see what was hiding in the darkness. And then it stepped into the light. It was a man, or at least it had once been a man. He was tall and gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His clothes were tattered, hanging off him in ragged strips, and his eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to absorb the light. He moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, his limbs stiff and uncoordinated, as if he were unused to walking. For a moment, we just stared at each other. and I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. The man's head tilted to the side as if studying me, and then he began to move toward me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern in my haste to retreat. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs refused to obey. The man's movements were slow, deliberate, and with each step he took, I felt the walls of my sanity close in. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, he vanished. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, swallowed by the shadows as if he had never been there at all. I stood there trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The lantern's light flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the graves. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the man, but there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence and the weight of my own fear. That night, I didn't go back to the car. I couldn't bring myself to move, too terrified that if I took my eyes off the darkness, something would reach out and drag me into it. I stayed there, rooted to the spot, until the first light of dawn washed over the cemetery, banishing the shadows and whatever horrors they concealed. The days turned into weeks, and the cemetery became my prison. The lanterns continued to fail, the voices grew louder, and the footsteps never ceased. I was a shell of the man who had taken this job, hollowed out by fear and sleepless nights. My reflection in the mirror was gaunt, my eyes sunken and haunted, and the dark circles under them seemed to grow with each passing day. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. The rules had kept me alive this long, and I was determined to see it through, to make it until the end of my tenure. The caretaker had told me there was only one more week left, and then my replacement would arrive. I clung to that thought like a lifeline, repeating it to myself over and over whenever the darkness threatened to consume me. The last night I worked there, I followed every rule to the letter, but the cemetery had become a living nightmare. The voices, the footsteps, the lanterns, all of it was getting worse. The darkness seemed alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy that made my skin crawl. As I finished my rounds, the lanterns began to flicker out one by one, plunging the cemetery into darkness. My breath quickened as I fumbled to relight them, but the matches wouldn't catch. The wind howled and the gates rattled violently, as if something on the other side was desperate to get in. I sprinted toward the gate, the rules burning in my mind, but when I reached it, I found it wide open. My heart stopped as I realized what this meant. Never, under any circumstances, open the gate after midnight, but it was too late. From the darkness beyond the gate, something emerged. It was a man, tall, gaunt, and dressed in tattered clothes. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and piercing. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remember the rules. I grabbed the gate and tried to slam it shut, but the man was too close now, his hand reaching out to stop me. Just as his fingers grazed the metal, the bell in the nearby church tower began to chime, signaling the first light of dawn. The man froze, his form wavering, and then he vanished, leaving only the echoes of the bell and the rustling of leaves in his wake. I locked the gate with trembling hands, the adrenaline finally wearing off, leaving me exhausted and terrified. As the sun rose, I walked the cemetery one last time, making sure all the graves were undisturbed. The cemetery was quiet again, the air still and heavy. I handed in my resignation the next day. The caretaker, his eyes still sunken and hollow, simply nodded, as if he had been expecting it. I never returned to that cemetery, but the memories haunt me to this day. The last thing I did before leaving was fold the rules carefully and tuck them into my pocket. They were the only things that had kept me alive, and I knew better than to ignore them. Some nights when I can't sleep, I find myself reciting them under my breath, the words a protective mantra against whatever lurks in the darkness. And though I'll never set foot in that cemetery again, I know one thing for certain. Whoever takes my place, they'd better follow the rules, because some doors once opened can never be closed.